Hello, and wishing you a very, very good day. My name is Metka Zupancic. I am Professor Emerita of French and Modern Languages at the University of Alabama at Tuscaloosa, which means that I have completed my active cycle of duties at the university and that have now moved back to my home country, Slovenia, where I continue my research, which I am very, very happy to share with you today. I am very deeply grateful to the Eurasia Foundation project for 2023, Sustainable Development, Narratives of the Anthropocene. And I'm really, really grateful to the Complutense University of Madrid in Spain for inviting me, and in particular, Professor Asun Lopez Varela Arzcarate, who is in charge of coordinating this big endeavor. Now, the title of my presentation is Gender of Myth-Making. And I may not be the only one asking this question. I will return to a better, more detailed explanation of what I mean with it. But I would like to start with the connection that exists between the study of myth and sustainable development. Why? Since this year's project deals with narratives, I would like to emphasize the fact that the word myth, mythos, means in Greek anything that relates to stories, discourse, words, narratives, and that in this sense, one of the definitions of the many definitions of myth might be the following. Mythical narratives are based on belief systems, and they in turn create new beliefs and behaviors. And in doing so, they shape our lives. I would like to speak of the dominant ideologies and about the possibility to change them, of course. So there are two leading narratives in our times, and I think we all agree: patriarchy on the one hand and capitalism. And I could add eventually the monotheistic religions, but that's another story, and maybe we should not enter into that discussion right now. But I would like to emphasize the fact that a dominant ideology of a particular time is founded on shared belief systems. And then, of course, for a system to persist, there needs to be a set of people who share the whole thinking process. But I'm asking particularly what new narratives can then be developed and how these new paradigms can come into existence. And in order to support my questioning more than any answers I could give with certainty, I would like to refer to somebody who really emphasized the possibility of changing the paradigms and arrive at new belief systems through the change of the paradigms. His name is Rupert Sheldrake, born in 1942. He's a biologist mainly, a philosopher of biology. And his point is that there are, not so in a Platonian sense, but that there are these ideas that exist at a certain level, but they are not fixed. They move, they change, they transform themselves. He calls them morphogenetic fields of information. Now he speaks more of the hypothesis of morphic resonance, how things resonate at an intangible level, but how things become prevalent when many people adhere to a certain philosophy, a certain belief system. And he gives many examples, but languages are a very good case in point. For example, we know how many people now communicate through English. And in order for English to have become such a powerful tool of communication or miscommunication at times, many people had to adhere to the major field of information. I speak, my mother tongue is Slovene, and it's a small language spoken maybe by 2.5 million people in Slovenia and in the world. So it would take enormous amount of energy to feed this morphogenetic field so that Slovene would become more appreciated or spoken at a larger level. So taking in consideration Rupert Sheldrake's positions, I'm asking the question, what the world would be like if another mythology were at the core of our interactions among humans and with the universe. So what about new mythologies, new narratives? I'm particularly interested in a possibility that some sisterly narratives, matrilinear new mythologies could come into existence that would help establish, as I say, new global connections and new social structures. And I'm very, very curious to know what these new narratives would contain and how they would relate to the myth we inherited from the past, because myths have existed since humanity. And what do we do with them? How have we forgotten some that have been important at a certain time? And how have we misinterpreted many of them throughout history? I am looking at an author whom I appreciate enormously and who has had an enormous impact on my own research, but I'm taking from her a definition of myth, not in the sense that she would endorse it, but what she is afraid that the myth is becoming. Her name is Elizabeth Sewell. She wrote in 1960 a seminal work, The Orphic Voice, Poetry and Natural History combined. And the book was reissued this year, a year ago almost, in 2022 by New York Review Books. And it contains an introduction by Debbie Schenk, which is very, very valuable because it synthesizes Elizabeth Sewell's thought. And I think her thought has become even more prevalent in today's time with the new trends in biology, in geology, in earth sciences. But we all might agree that what she is afraid of in terms of the forthcoming attitude toward myth is what we're living today. How often do we hear in the media among ourselves speaking of, oh, that's a myth, that's a lie? So basically what she says, and I'm quoting her, the word myth is used nowadays almost exclusively in a negative or even disapproving way. It is held to relate to a belief or set of beliefs which are invented by fantasy and do not correspond except figuratively with anything real. End of quote. And then something that pertains to our work, to what we do as scholars, and I'm quoting, a modern scholar will be bound eventually to set scientific thought over against mythological thinking and give his allegiance to science. And my computer just jumped to the next slide. So why am I so interested in Elizabeth Sewell? Because whenever I worked with contemporary literature, for example, I saw the appearance of myth. And when I started reading her book, I got the answers to some of my persistent questions. She gives a predominant role in mythology to Orpheus, an all-encompassing force, and we could go into some esoteric interpretation of why she holds Orpheus in such a huge respect. But I would add that she doesn't speak much of Eurydice, and what we scholars of contemporary feminist literature deal with is mainly an appearance of a new Eurydice who may have the same characteristics almost like Orpheus. And what are those? Myth is, as Elizabeth Sewell claims, a unifying force for all human endeavors. Language and mind. Language works with and on the most astonishing of biological phenomena, the human mind. I think we'll all agree that we work out of these bodies and that we cannot be anything but human bodies speaking a language that is our unifying force, although we don't speak the same language eventually. What I'm very interested in is that all striving and learning is mythologizing. And you see the quotes on the slide. What is also very useful for interpreting contemporary holistic art forms, literature, art, dance, and music, and the big new projects, performances, is that from Elizabeth Sewell's position, the Orphic myth contains these 5 formal systems: dance and ritual, music and rhythm, plastic arts and forms of visual pattern, mathematics, word, language that encompasses very often all of them. And what is extremely important is that that Elizabeth Sewell insists on the circular, analogical, post-logical thinking, because in her views, myth is always post-logical. Now, if I bring together Elizabeth Sewell and Rupert Sheldrake, and if we think in terms of mythologies, we need to think of how we create these narratives. Myth is narrative, right? And how then, if we open our mouth and we create a speech, how we immediately also speak from a belief system, or we create a new belief system. In Sheldrake's words, if there are dysmorphic resonances, and as he called them in 81 when he first published his book, the morphogenetic fields of information, how will they be changing? They are subject to change, as everything in life is. So, and I'm giving some pointers there. With the influx of new ideas, new narratives, new myths will be created. The more people will join in their energies, the stronger they will become, these new narratives. There's not much time left for the new paradigms to become prevalent. And I think that many of us agree with this affirmation. Now, my major question throughout my talk is, could feminine-oriented mythologies, transformed and adapted to the new awareness, become the beacons for the future post-human development? And in order to see what we may create for the future, we do need to look at the past, the legacy, and at the ways the past mythologies, belief systems, narratives have been interpreted. And it's really difficult, and that's why I'm asking, what can be said with certainty about ancient social, biological, and spiritual dimensions? That's why it's a question, because you will see there are many researchers who have worked on past digs, past artifacts inherited from millennia back, but what do we know about them and how to interpret them? Now, I'm offering this reflection when exploring the origins of feminine mythical figures from remote periods in time. Do we know whether they were born out of male or female imagination? This is what really carries my whole reflection here. And how do we find out whether a myth reflects a male projection of social spiritual relationships, symbolized through these stories, the myth, and which were the paradigms needed at a certain period to condense in a traditional, conventional version of a myth that, or a character that we now call like an Orphic myth or a Eurydice myth or Antigone myth. And I'm continuing with this questioning about the basic tenets and considerations about these processes in theoretical works that constitute the foundations of myth criticism, which from the scholarly perspective is the study of how myths function and how they change. And I will return to it. Well, my question, again, and I'll be asking many questions, is whether the theoretical approaches are able to recognize the historic conditioning of the voices that narrate a particular mythical story. And I'm asking what impact will today's reenactments and often profound modifications of past mythical paradigms have on theory that is emerging from such practices? And do the new forms of ancient myth still reproduce the core elements that allow us to recognize a particular scheme, a mythologem, as belonging to the same tradition? And I'm using a word here, mythologem, which I will explain. And why is it important to recognize the legacy, the lineage? All this may be condensed in a question asked by a French social psychologist, Denise Jodelet, who wrote an article about the wolf as a possible new figure for a feminine imaginary. And she reflects on this part of her title, a reflection on the dimension of the mythical dimension of social representations. The article dates back to 2010, and I cannot deal with the whole dimension of the article, but what I really was struck by was the question, and I'm only reading my translation of what she wrote in French. I wonder whether any myth or a mythical figure might originate from women. So how could a myth have been created by a female community? Well, she regrets and says, alas, the great feminine figures, positive or negative, albeit represented in the stories created collectively, generally appear through images that have been forged by men and for men's enjoyment. Now, if we're dealing with mythology, we need to recognize those who have helped us shape the theories, the theoretical approaches. And I spoke about myth criticism. Without Gilbert Durand, who died some 10 years ago, we would not have what we call now myth criticism and also myth analysis. So what's the difference between the two, and what is entailed in the system? How do we deal with mythology through this lens, through this approach? We look for the smallest significant mythical units, and they can be, in French, they are called mythèmes. They can be translated as mythèmes, mythemes, or mythologems. Both words appear in various translations from French. And so when we see this mythemes congregating in a mythical story, we can then decide whether they remain in the framework of a story that seemingly has been passed on to us from the past, but which doubtless and inevitably has also changed. Again, I'm asking this question, what happens to the initial or qualified or best known mythical narrative? Gilbert Durand was extremely prolific scholar, writer, and I'll just mention something that I don't quote here, but in the early 60s, he kind of stirred a lot of deep waters in the study of mythology with his really important book, Les structures anthropologiques de l'imaginaire, the structural, the anthropological structures of the human imaginary. Imaginary being not just the imagination, but the whole realm of symbols, archetypes, myths, images that we carry in our heads and in our interactions. I took a more pedagogical article from 87 in a journal that he co-edited with another very important myth critic, Simone Vierne. They both worked in Grenoble in France for the longest time. And so I'm quoting in English again. You see highlighted the parts that I think are very crucial, but I'll read my English translation. When setting grounds for an approach based on myth criticism or myth analysis, it is necessary to accurately identify all the myth themes involved in the lessons that constitute a given myth, without the need to consider the primordial lesson. The real problem is the vital minimum of the myth themes that help us identify a particular myth. A myth should not lose too many myth themes, or its nature will be tainted, just as the identity of a myth will be lost when one or two myth themes are modified. So, myth criticism deals with synchronicity of all the myth themes. And then myth analysis, that I also quote here, is a study across centuries, and both combine, because if we don't consider the changes that have occurred within a myth, we cannot decide whether a myth theme has been lost or not. So both work hand in hand. And when there is a change in a myth that's too wide or too important, Gilbert Durand mentions heresy. So I have a little suggestion here. Maybe when feminist scholars and writers in the first place use the Orphic myth, but through the Eurydice perception, they've created a heresy already. So the myth has changed. It's very, very prevalent throughout. It's been prevalent throughout humor, Western, especially Western history, in arts, and yet there has been this big change that has occurred already. Basically, the myth will change when different communities will affect it. And I'm saying a female group might be able to change the basic mythologisms, myth themes that compose a particular mythical narrative. And I'm quoting again Durand. Within the archetypal texture of a myth, the large historical cultural groupings seem to privilege a particular set of sequences, a chosen combination of myth themes that may produce more or less heretical lessons. So we may have a Prometheus myth throughout history, but it will change in a particular setting, or let's say we'll have Orphic myth in Renaissance, and then it will sort of disappear maybe in the 17th century, come back in the 18th century through other forms, but it may become heretical as it evolves. In order to understand what has been done with myth, how they have changed, and what has been inherited from the past, I have a combination here. There's a woman who has created her own mythology, Christine Downing, and she is honoring, is giving tribute to somebody who in the States has been an incredibly important mythologist. He wasn't a myth critic, probably. He was more a historian of myth, and we may guess a little bit who were the sources of his thinking, how he synthesized many theories from archaeology, anthropology. But it's interesting that what Joseph Campbell I'm talking about, who lived until 87, how he may have shared some of the views that the feminists of his own time have also been promoting in terms of mythology. So there are 4 books of the Masks of God, 4 volumes, and The Hero with 1,000 Faces by Joseph Campbell has had enormous following also in Europe, with his idea of a monomyth, that there's always this hero's journey behind any endeavor. And then with Bill Moyers, the journalist, Joseph Campbell had this sequence of, I think, 12 shows, the TV shows with the images in the 80s, which was quite amazing to bring together the world mythologies in this TV series that became also a book, The Power of Myth. So what I'm interested in now is the past. What did we inherit from the past so that we can see the perseverance of mythical energy in today's time, or what did we not understand fully about the past, about the belief systems, the narratives that shaped these societies and the lives of the people 3, 4, 5, 7,000 years back. Neanderthals, we remember maybe that they preceded the Homo sapiens, that they disappeared at a certain point, that they were buried, says Campbell, and Christine Downing insists upon it. Campbell believes that there must have been something related to Mother Earth cult, because people were buried in a form of in a shape of a fetus, so that they would be reborn. And he still believes that all those nude female figures, which I haven't mentioned yet, but which have been dug out in the 60s, in the 70s, at a major rate, after they've been dug out maybe in the 19th century and created first theories about myth. But the many, as I quote here, many nude female figures found at early Paleolithic sites, Paleolithic goes 30,000, 40,000 years back, may be seen as the first objects of human worship, of cult. And it's still a controversy, as you'll see toward the end of my talk. Although Campbell would not go for like matriarchy or female-oriented cult. He says, without any patriarchal or matriarchal emphasis. But he agrees that there was historical suppression of the goddess, albeit it has survived. The goddess has survived in some ways throughout history. Toward the end of the Bronze Age, which is about 3,000 plus years back, the mythology, I'm quoting him, mythology of the mother goddess was radically transformed by patriarchal nomadic herder warriors like Hebrews, and maybe that's just one example of those hordes that came from, we don't know where, Central Asia, and that had another attitude toward life and relationships in the society. But what Campbell also says, and Christine Downing is quoting him, in Greece, unlike Israel, the patriarchal gods married the goddesses of the land, and so the goddess survived in agricultural cults, in women's ritual life, and in the Orphic and Eleusinian mysteries. So it's interesting that Eleusis, one of the 3 major temples dedicated to Persephone and Demeter, the earth goddesses, is going to be promoted as the cultural center of Europe this year, the 23, and that it does undergo renovations. And this is wonderful that the Greeks themselves are finding value in reestablishing the connection with the old rites. I will also read you the last quote from Joseph Campbell and Chris Downing's article to honor Joseph Campbell. There was violence and loss involved in the suppression of the goddess. For Joseph Campbell, today, mythology will become more of a personal approach, psychological, and the same stands for Christine Downing, who, as you see here, has written the book Goddess, Mythological Images of the Feminine, first published in 1981, republished a number of times. And for her, and this was on the previous slide, and the computer is just moving on by itself, she wanted to work together with like-minded women in a community of like-minded women. I should emphasize that when Christine Downing published this book, a whole group of feminists created this goddess movement, and they really believed in a possible connection with the matriarchy 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years back. For her, there's a combination of scholarship and the reenactment of the archetypes that she recognized it in herself. And I'll give you an example. She was abandoned, for example, by a lover, and she felt as Ariadne abandoned on the island of Naxos. So that's how she lived the myth, the archetype. But she wants to go back to the more archaic mother goddess tradition, in plural, not just one. She truly believes that the feminine energy is transformative because these transformations are never absolute spiritualizations also. She really emphasizes the corporal realm, which has never been abandoned. And I want to connect her to Elizabeth Sewell, who never mentions this feminist because they did not gather yet in such a form and shape. And Chris Downing doesn't recognize the work by Elizabeth Sewell. They were in different circles, and 10 years in the second part of last century was a lot for the changes that occurred. But Elizabeth Sewell speaks of this body mythology, the myth that goes through the body, which corresponds to what cognitive psychology, the new trends in psychology and anthropology and other approaches have proven, that they're in biology and neurology, that we have guts that think, and that we carry memories in our whole body. This is what the feminists in the 70s and the 80s of the previous century kind of felt as a possible dimension that they wanted to explore. The theories or the positions, the hypothesis is that Chris Downing developed come from the whole group of women, especially from Marilyn Stone, when God was a woman, from 76. Marilyn Stone was a sculptoress, and she really claims that the goddess was, and I'm reading from my slide, was necessarily the first object of symbolic construction for both men and women. And in the beginning, people prayed to the creatress of life, the mistress of heaven. At the very dawn of religion, God was a woman. And what I'm interested in is that there's no distinction between religion and mythology and ritual, neither for Stone nor for Downing. And they are talking of this utopian times in the past, and they never define it. But they must have been aware, and especially Christine Downing is clearly aware that in the 19th century, men already developed some hypotheses about possible women-based religions in prehistory. So she mentions Johann Jakob Bachhofen, a Swiss lawyer, actually, who was very, very interested in the findings of the early ethnographers, and they were not called archaeologists at the time. So if he was one of the earliest researchers of the mother goddess tradition, or traditions mainly, he, in Christine Downing's perception, wrote from the son's image of the mother. I would say an overbearing problem of some men with the notion of mother's energy. At the same time, as this big, big goddess movement in mainly Anglo-Saxon world, we have an archaeologist who is also a mythologer, Maria Gimbutas from Lithuania, and who worked at UCLA, Los Angeles-based University of California, who was incredibly strong in her convictions, but was creating a lot of controversy with her finds. She performed the digs, especially in the Mediterranean, and called this area the Old European. And so she is an archaeo-mythological researcher, scholar, and she claims that through somebody who edited her last book, The Living Goddess in 1999 is her last book, edited by Miriam Robbins Dexter, her longtime friend and assistant, who summarizes Maria Gimbutas' thinking. It is believed, and I'm quoting, that the old Europeans worshipped the full cycle of birth, death, and rebirth in the form of a great goddess. The goddess was one and many, the great goddess of the life continuum, the goddess of birth, death, and rebirth. She was the creator and the destroyer, the maiden, the crone, and the goddess of the prime of life. She believes, Gimbutas, and this is the quote, the next quote is from her directly, that the old European social structure was matrilineal. The society was organized around the theocratic, so thea, not theo, democratic temple communities. And she is convinced that in all old Europe, there is no evidence for the Indo-European type of patriarchal chieftainate. And she repeats similar positions throughout her book and in her previous, many, many previous books. Now, there has been, as we saw, this whole approach at the end of the 19th century, second part of 19th century, with men who wrote about myth, female myth, the great goddess. And we have the 70s, 80s, the big movement of goddess theology. But in 2011, Cynthia Eller, a much younger scholar, questions all these assumptions. And the title of her book, Gentlemen and Amazons, is an indication of where she wants to go. So she is really critiquing the idea of a matriarchal myth from the prehistoric times. She mentions a set of contemporary thinkers, but she also, particularly in this book, goes back to the second part of the 19th century to show through these keywords, matriarchy, matrilineal kinship, down to patriarchy, matriarchy, that this whole belief system was maybe invented because, as she says, matriarchy in prehistoric times may be a recent invention. And she definitely just claims that we, the humans, invent what we wish to believe. So that's a good thought, right, for us who would want to invent something that would change our lives on Earth. And maybe we should just strongly believe in it, and maybe things will happen. So Cynthia Eller is quoting, again, Johann Jakob Bachhofen, who in 1861 wrote this book, Mutterich. That's the beginning of her uh, group of studies. But what she reproaches Bachhofen is that he's using the classical myths as reliable tools for recovery of prehistory without the real ethnographical findings that would support it. And she defines also the rise and the fall of this matriarchal hypothesis toward the beginning of the 20th century, and mentions all these women in the 70s. So I'm summarizing a little bit what she wrote, eager to find a pre-existing model for their own claims, which includes also Christine Downing. And they use the goddess-oriented myth-making hypothesis. I would like at this point to bring in another larger non-European comparative view. Because we saw how Gimbutas considered the old great goddess as multifaceted, everything that a woman could be, a woman in a symbolic sense. And what I find, because I'm very interested in Indian mythology and in Indian language as carrier of maybe deeper secrets, Sanskrit, the old language that may contain some contents, vibrations, indications that we haven't untangled yet. But in India, one of the most revered and feared mythical figures is Kali, the Indian goddess, who is, and I'm quoting Tamara Dietrich, a Slovene scholar who worked extensively her whole life on India and Hinduism and Buddhism. The living goddess is, as she says, a dangerous, wild, bloodthirsty, violent deity, a destructive goddess, uncontrolled lover, and a gentle mother, the creator and destroyer of the universe. She's everything. And this makes me believe that both men and women have contributed to the myth making, the perpetration, and the transformation of the old mythical paradigms in this context. And that this way, maybe it was possible to escape the patriarchal overpowering that possibly happened to the goddess traditions everywhere else in the world, or mostly elsewhere in the world. Now, myth goes back to the origins, right? Jose Manuel Losada, who is an author of many, many books on mythology and recently published 800 plus pages book, Mitocritica Cultural, the culture of myth criticism. He has dealt extensively with the origins and the definition of myth, which for him is always etiological. It's the last word, an etiology, the explanation of the world, because for him, studying myth shows us how all cultures have tried to follow the development from chaos into cosmos. And myth, when it's been created, is already in the cosmos, in this dimension. But so what are the origins of myth and of symbolic thinking? And what about the myth of origins? If we agree with Losada, all myth will talk of the origins of life on Earth. But where myth analysis would then compare different stories and see whether they collide or whether they differ. And there's no end to this study, as I can assure you. So we don't know what the origin of feminine myth might have been. Hence, it's necessary to look at scholars who have dealt with it. And I was very lucky to find the book by Rosemary Redford Ruther, who died in 22, and who really tried to look at all Mediterranean religions and see how they dealt with the feminine figure. And what she says, that we don't have any written documents that would prove us what happened in the past regarding the goddess cult or goddess religion. But she's also very wary. She does not believe that this figurines or any digs that were found in this Mediterranean area might point at a survival of some original pro-woman great goddess who goes back to Paleolithical times. So she does not believe it. And I strongly recommend going to her book and compare with your own experiences what you think might have been the story behind what she explores. But we must agree with her that there is this absence of text by women throughout Western history that would tell us how these women related to goddesses. And we don't know whether they might have been myth makers in their own right. Going back to that initial question, what would happen, as Denise Jodelet asks, if myth were to be put together by women? Now, I showed through this contemporary women, post-Jungian authors, feminists, really more so, who, like Jean Shinoda Bolen, as I showed you through Christine Downing, Jean Shinoda Bolen created a whole series of books dealing with mythology in a way that maybe the Greek scholars would not agree upon. So she has the book The Goddesses in Every Woman. She has a book Gods in Every Man, Goddesses in Elder Women, and another series of books that are very, very helpful for self-discovery, which proves that Joseph Campbell was right, that Christine Downing was right, saying that myth is playing a particular personal role. But that's how this myth-making can become feminine. And of course, it's inevitably integrated in the general anthropologically conditioned continuous transformation of mythical narratives and paradigms. And there is a whole set of issues to discuss further. And I'm returning to what we saw with Durand and his ideas of heresy in the myth-making or the development of mythology. And again, a question, what happens to the mythemes, mythologies that constitute the great goddess mythology in today's time, if we consider Durand's indications about the two major requirements for recognition of a mythical narrative? So that vital minimum. And what happens, and I'm just leaving this French sentence here, when one mytheme changes, or two of them change, the whole identity of a myth changes. And so I'm suggesting here that maybe the new Eurydice that I have also worked with and other colleagues have dealt with extensively is a heresy and a major shift within the Orphic myth itself, as I have suggested earlier. And then there's another notion of transcendence, because in José Manuel Losada's perception, myth cannot exist if it's not transcendent. And I would suggest that in view of that incarnate theology, mythology is a personal experience with an archetype, there is a possibility for a collective transcendence, as I will show in this slide, because in 82, a group of women published an enormous book, also spanning 700 pages, I believe, or 800. And Shalene Spretnak, one of those goddess-believing myth makers and mythologists, she put together the writings by scholars, artists, poets, and what this book is creating is new unity through diversity. So there is a new form of collective transcendence, because what the contributors to this book are emphasizing is how each of them might recognize a particular archetype and identify with it. But all together, they recreate this great goddess that Maria Gimbutas believed existed at one time. Although this has been such an enormous endeavor, toward the end of the book, in the third subdivision, the subtitle says, "Are goddesses and matriarchies merely figments of feminist imagination?" So there is doubt. We don't know. Maybe yes, maybe not. But the important is maybe to work on this notions and move forward with the new awareness. I also found a recent article by Catherine Roundtree, and there's a lot of writing about the whole notion of goddess theories, goddess beliefs. But this one is interesting because it's written by a woman. The politics of the goddess, feminist spirituality, and the essentialism debate, because of course they were accused of being essentialists. Such articles can help us explain the phenomena some 50 years ago and offer new directions toward new narratives, or we can then create new directions altogether. So if there was one large great goddess figure, we have this proliferation now, and we then, through different contributors, can see this maternal aspects of womanhood, and I'm quoting here, but also the warrior, the virgin, the destructive crone. The proliferation, dispersion, and then the new unity at a new level. And I'm showing you with my hands all this movement, let's say a figure 8 movement, when destruction precedes new reconstruction. And it is a sign of our, let's say, post modern times with deconstruction that, of course, Jacques Derrida in the first place and other philosophers have imposed on our thinking. But is there a possibility for transcendence? That's my major question, right? Now, when we think already that there has been such a huge movement and such energy invested in creating new forms of thinking, I see that the debate has not reached a consensus among archaeologists, anthropologists. And I found a very interesting article by Ariana Carta, a young scholar, who wrote about the figurines. That's her title of her article. And it's still remaining an open question whether these archaeological theories have ever admitted that there was a long period of prehistory dominated by female depictions, many of which were found in cultic settings. So if a young scholar hasn't found among her predecessors, archaeologists, anthropologists, viable acceptance of such possible explanations, where do we stand now? And so I'm really pretty happy to see that she asks, who is afraid of the goddess? And of course, who is afraid of Gimbutas, because she was the major proponent of the goddess past matrilinear societies. So I need to confirm that in the past, women-centered societies um, cannot be proven as having guaranteed a more harmonious life for the entire communities. That's one of the utopias that has been promoted by some feminist thinkers and writers. And I also showed, I hope so, that it's impossible to apply the goddess cult or a goddess cult such as imagined from the past. We cannot be honoring the goddess the way the past civilizations have done it. But I would say, and this is my last slide, it is possible to create new narratives, new mythologies, better adapted to today's pressing need of all. And I would just conclude by saying that there's so much going on in terms of research and developments among archaeologists who may still be on the sides of the mainstream trends that explore the women's role, past and present, and that we all need to reevaluate those positions. There is this recent documentary about Lady Sapiens, Homo sapiens, and the woman in these communities that claims, based on too few artifacts, apparently, because it created a huge controversy, that these women were hunters, not just their partners, their male partners, but these women were fighting big animals and could have had a major role in the society. We don't know, of course. And then you remember the slide about gentlemen and Amazons. Amazons have been considered as a figment of Greek imagination, like a fear of the whole new patriarchal society of these women warriors who may have come and destroyed the patriarchal system. Well, a scholar that has proven the validity of her explorations, Adrian Mayer, speaks of Amazons, lives and legends of warrior women across the ancient world, and claims that Amazons absolutely existed and that we do need to look into the past with a new set of eyes. I have 3 pages of references. It's hard to read probably, but I hope that I could share some of this bibliographical elements if needed with whoever is interested in what I have presented here. And I am very happy to have been with you. And I thank you very much for your attention, and would be very glad to share any discussions with you if the opportunity presents itself. Thank you very much.